Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Counting on Chazin. This is a wonderful series that Chazin Company has created to help nonprofits achieve their mission, vision, and values with understanding the implications of accounting a little bit more. Today, we're really excited because we have Michelle Jilek, CPA, one of the wonderful brain trusts, if you don't mind me calling you that, of Chazin Company, back to talk with us. And we're going to be talking about something that everybody's really buzzing about right now. And that is tracking grant activity and how that can make you more successful with your funders. And, Michelle, this is one of those hot buttons that it just seems because of the pandemic and the way things have kind of moved through, grants are just popping up everywhere. Have you noticed that?
I have noticed that there are a lot more opportunities available to nonprofits, particularly our small and mid-sized nonprofits, and grant reporting can be a little intimidating.
It really can. And that's why we're so excited to have you back on to kind of help us navigate this big topic, because the reality is we chase money, right? I think we see these grant applications and we're like, oh my gosh, we would be a perfect fit, and we get all excited. Then we wait on pins and needles to get that grant award, and then we're like, whew, okay, we did it. But I think you're going to tell us that no, this is just the start. So where do we start? We won that award. What are some of the first steps?
Sure. So once we've won the award, we need to look at what are we going to be required to report and how do we track that in our accounting system to have accurate information on a timely basis to report to our grantors and to report to our board and management as they're reviewing our progress within the grant. So I think it requires some upfront planning, looking at that grant agreement, determining the requirements and then the frequency of reporting, and then setting up our accounting system to provide us that information. And if we do that up front, it will be much easier than if we wait until the report is due.
I love that. And you said something really magical right there. I think a lot of what I have thought about is that this is external, but you slipped it in there that this is internal as well, so that we're not just reporting back out to the funder, but to our board and to management. I think that's an interesting thing, because as you note, some of these grants go on for years. And so you might have a change of staff, certainly a board leadership. It kind of gives me a different sensibility when we're talking about this. So let me ask you this next question. Aren't grant reports all the same?
Well, actually, they're not. It depends on the funder and the funder's requirements. So we see a lot of our foundation grants that may give us a lump sum up front, and then at the end, we report back on how we spent the money. And it could be a 3-year program. It could require reporting every 6 months. There are a lot of new federal dollars out there that are coming from the federal government directly and from the state governments. And those are usually cost reimbursement and require monthly reporting. So we need to be prepared for the level of detail those particular reports require as well.
Really interesting, tracking that cash flow, which is the bane of everyone's existence in the nonprofit sector, and I should say the for-profit sector too. But I really appreciate how you highlight that difference, because it really does speak to what we're doing internally. And one of those things that I want to get you to drill down with us a little bit more is in our reporting, how we can be tracking these things. And if you can help us understand something you're calling dimension account coding. That sounds awfully serious.
It sounds serious, but it's really not. But we need to figure out what accounting system we're using and how we can track those particular grant activities, the receipts and disbursements within that system. So if we're using a robust system like an Intact, we would use a project code, which is a dimension. If we're using a robust system like an MIP or Great Plains, we use a cost center. Again, that's just a dimension for tracking, but we can pull reports by that dimension code to determine what we've received and what we've spent to prepare those grant reports. And if we're a small nonprofit and we're using QuickBooks, there are some simple ways we can track dimensionally as well. At Chazin, we like to use the class dimension. If we're a small nonprofit and we have 3 or 4 grants, it's easy to use class, and we can generate a statement of activity by class that we can even pull into Excel to manipulate the numbers for our specific grant report, but we've got our statement of activity there by class and available to us in real time.
Wow, and amazing. I'm thinking about all this information that will help you as a nonprofit be a better steward of those funds, but also be in a better relationship with your funder because you can give them such specific information, right? I mean, it seems like you can actually just, like I said, be a better partner in this process.
Sure, and your funders want to know that you're tracking their dollars, each of their dollars, and some funders have some very specific requirements. For example, I know here in the state of Tennessee, if you have a state grant, you not only have to provide a copy of each invoice for each expense, you have to provide your payment method. So it's the front and back of your canceled check, or it's the ACH verification from bill.com. And it's much easier if we're accumulating that data and tracking within the system, even pulling down and saving that on our shared drive to have available when we're ready to submit that grant report. And generally that's monthly. So that could be a lot of work at the end of a month, or if we fall behind the end of a 6-week period and we're waiting on our funding until we've submitted that report and that it's been approved. So we definitely want to be ahead of it.
Okay, this is a curveball, but
okay.
Just that you're good at this. But I'm curious, and I don't know if you have an answer for this, but I'm amazed what you just said. That's a heck of a lot of work, and those have real costs. Can we ever build that cost of performance into this grant process, or is that something that we just have to move over into operations and just say cost of doing business?
Well, it depends on the grant, because often our grants, particularly state and federal, allow us to apply for an indirect cost rate. So federal grants has what we abbreviate as a NICRA, which is our indirect cost rate. That is something that you have to have certified every, I think, 3 years. But it is allowing us that indirect cost associated with overseeing those grants. And so, for example, it might be that you determine it's 17%. So we don't want to leave that 17% on the table.
Yeah.
We want to get that from the grantor.
Okay, so a couple things. We actually have another episode of Counting on Chazin just about NICRA. So I kind of want to plug that if you want, if you will. And I think that's fascinating about that aspect of leaving those funds or the ability to use that money on the table. That's a really interesting concept, because I bet that happens a lot, that we don't
Right.
really monitor it correctly. I mean, is that fair to say?
It is fair to say, and we don't want to leave that money on the table, or we don't want to have to pull other dollars to support those operating costs that we could get covered by grant funds. Again, if we're chasing dollars and that's our motive as a grant manager, we want to have accurate information to get the most dollars we're eligible for.
Right. Okay, now, so you've talked about a lot of sophistication, understanding that the 1.8 million nonprofits in our country are all different sizes, all different capacities. Some have internal, robust accounting and finance departments. Probably the majority don't, and we're
Right.
working with providers like you all at Chazin Company. I gotta ask, could we just do all this on a spreadsheet? And would that be easier?
Well, I'm an accountant, so I love spreadsheets, but no. And I say no because I think it opens us up to more errors
Okay.
and leaving that money on the table, because we could miss an expense. where if we've been coding everything correctly in our system,
Yeah.
and again, if we need, some of our funders may require very high level reporting that is not as detailed as our accounting system, but we can pull that data into Excel from our accounting system and sum it. And we've still got more, we don't miss an expense that way, or we don't miss realizing that we already requested that reimbursement. So we want, Excel is not going to be our most accurate method, even if we do need to pull a report into Excel to come up with that, those total, maybe our grantor only requires 3 categories of reporting expenses, but we have 20 natural accounts that make up those 3 categories. We can just pull that report into Excel and sum it, and that takes about 5 minutes.
Wow. It's interesting too, because listening to you today, I'm thinking that um, the more you do this and the more you understand, the easier it's going to get, or maybe not easier, but more efficient. And you're going to understand what your team has to do if you're contracting with outside providers. But talk about the frequency of this. I mean, you mentioned that some funders are going to want something every month, some are going to want things at the end of the year. What are you seeing in Chazin and Company? What are some of these frequency requirements that are more realistic?
Honestly, it depends on the type of grantor. So federal and state are going to be monthly in their cost reimbursement. And
Okay.
I think that's what intimidates folks the most, is
Yeah.
that frequency and how do we get this data? But if we set up our system correctly, it's not that tough. Most of our foundations are more annual reporting, and those are generally big dollars as well, but that's still needs to be very accurate. And one thing we didn't talk about, Julia, was the project module in QuickBooks.
Yeah.
Because what we're finding is that some of these foundation grants may be multi-year. I may receive a 3-year grant, and I need to report perhaps annually, but at the end of that grant, I need to have my 3-year report. And if I've thought about that in advance, I can set up the project module in QuickBooks. And again, it's a cost accounting module, so it follows the life of the project, not just your fiscal year. So we can pull that reporting out over the life of the project as well, and it makes that reporting a little bit simpler.
I love that you brought that up in relationship to these reporting modules, because I've got to tell you right now in the nonprofit sector, just from an HR lens, 3 years seems like 30 years. I
Right.
I mean, look at Michelle, how we have all been talking
Mhm.
across our sector about the movement with our staffs. I mean, think about having a 3-year funding project. You're going to have changes in your programming staff, your accounting staff, your bookkeeping staff. I've got to believe this project tracking has to become really tight and really well managed up front so that you can weather those storms.
Yes, and really having that good data from the start will help each new person coming in have information behind the numbers, what was being charged to the grant, what types of expenses we can look at that, and folks can have that multi-year reporting that's needed.
Wow, I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's just another one of those layers in this whole process that, again, can be kind of daunting, and might make you want to turn away from an opportunity just because it seems too hard to manage. The next thing I want to ask your feedback on, because we've been talking numbers and accounting software and tracking and all that, but I want to kind of go back to another piece, and sometimes we call it the storytelling, the narrative. And I'm wondering if you could kind of share with us, if that's appropriate, how that looks, and what are some of the things that we might track in that narrative.
Well, most of your grantors are interested in the narrative, particularly those big foundation grants, but we can use the numbers to write that story or to help tell that story. There are going to be numbers, for example, if you have a summer reading program, how many dollars did I spend per child on books versus how many dollars did I spend per child on tutors? how many children did I teach to read and what did that cost? Or maybe I can need to explain to my grantor how many dollars I spent on each region and what my outcomes were. So we can use the dollars to tell that narrative and to support that narrative that we're going to write to explain how we use the money.
I love it. And when you're talking about this right now, I almost feel like that could be pulled out and put somewhere in your communications plan. I mean, that becomes great content for use in other ways. I mean, so it shouldn't just be something
Sure, you could use that
you.
on your website
Yeah.
even. It's interesting information to have available to other funders and to potential just donors of unrestricted grants as well, to know who you're helping and how and what the dollars are going toward.
Well, and I got to believe that, there are a lot of foundations and there are a lot of funders that they want the community to know their work, right? And so it's a
Yes,
great marketing communication piece for that relationship as well. There's no reason why you shouldn't be promoting that partnership. I mean, if you ask me, I think that's one of those magical pieces that creates a really strong relationship going forward. So that as you build that relationship, you have more funding opportunities, or perhaps a funding opportunity that's created for your organization that wasn't part of what you actually even had thought of. So,
right, sure. And there are donors who require that you publish that information. For example, United Way funded partners have to include that on their website, that they're a United Way funded partner. And there are a number of large foundations who also ask for that recognition because they want their donors to know where their dollars are going as
right.
well.
Yeah, it's all part of that, relationship piece. I know this is not an accounting term, but we call it, the ROR, the return on relationship.
Sure.
It should be an accounting term. We all know ROI and return on investment, but that ROR, I think we need to be talking about that more. And I think this is part of that discussion. I want to end our time together. You said something at the get-go, and I think I want to revisit this because it's pretty profound. But you gave us this idea that if we make these investments up front, we're going to be better off in the long run. If it's a short term grant, if it's large, small, it seems like it needs to be done up front.
Sure, we need to do that pre-planning and we need to recognize that our grantor wants certain information from us. And if we have set up our system and we've worked with our accountants, and we have a number of clients we do this with, we say, hey, send us that grant agreement as soon as it's signed and we'll help you get it set up. And that's an important piece, is being able to do that reporting. So we want to understand what you can spend the money on. So we help you maximize that information available to your grantor.
Well, that was going to be kind of my follow-up question, was how much of that is on us, or is it okay to say, look, accounting provider, can you read this document? Can you figure this out and help us deal on this? Because it's so sophisticated. And it seems to me, Michelle, that if you don't start out right, you're going to be spending a lot of time and money and heartache and maybe even damaging your relationship with your grant funder by having to make corrections. I mean, right? It's not that
Sure.
lenient.
We never want to amend a grant report. We want to get it right the first time. And I
Yeah.
know grant reporting can be very intimidating. I don't see it that way because I've done it for a very long time, but also because I've worked with a number of organizations, and it's really about that upfront communication with your accounting team, whether it's your outsourced accountant like us or whether it's your in-house accountant. It's that upfront communication, and let the accountants do the legwork on how to report that correctly.
Yeah, I am so fascinated by this because we don't talk enough about this. We talk about finding grant writers, and we talk about understanding the grant application process. And I know with the American Nonprofit Academy, we kind of run that number that says you're only going to win about 30% of what you apply for on a national average. And some are a lot higher and some are a lot lower. But when you're looking at all of this work that you have to do just to get 30% of those, to win 30% of those grants that you submit, that can be pretty frustrating. So then you're lopping on top of that these reporting pieces. I think people just let that, kind of filter down to the bottom.
Right. I think it's exciting to get that funding, but then we get really intimidated at the end of the year when we have to file that report and we didn't plan in advance. So I think that's where just be an upfront partner with your accounting team. And once you receive that award, hand it to the accounting team to say, hey, now what?
Right. And
how do we track it?
Yeah, and to your point, start out, make these investments up front so that as you're moving through to finishing up, because the bottom line is you're going to be on to the next grant process or grant cycle or relationship. I mean, this is something, it's not a one and done. You're going to keep moving forward. So you have to have these things situated. Well, Michelle Jilek, you've been amazing. I always learn something from you, as I have with all of your other specialists and accounting providers at Chazin Company. Really interesting information that kind of helps me understand, and I think our viewers understand, how the grant process can really work and function in a more, I would say, healthy and less stressful way. You have been a marvel to have on today, another episode of Counting on Chazin. We have a lot of information. We have a lot of these episodes that you can go on to countingonchazin.com or chazinandcompany.com and learn more tips and insider views about how accounting really truly impacts your nonprofit. Michelle, thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia.